In the 1800s, this coast was not quiet. Indianola was one of the busiest gateways into Texas. Steamships came in from the Gulf. Families stepped onto the docks. Wagon wheels cut tracks through mud, hauling cargo toward ranches, settlements, and roads that were still being carved into the state. This was not a forgotten place. It was a port with noise, money, timber warehouses, salt air, and ambition. For a moment, Indianola looked like a city with a future. Then time moved. The docks emptied, the sky darkened, the water rose where wagons once rolled. Today, almost nothing on this shoreline tells you what used to stand here, because the Gulf of Mexico did not destroy Indianola once. It came back and destroyed it twice. So, how does a thriving Texas port vanish from the map? Indianola began with geography, a low stretch of Texas coast, Matagorda Bay, reaching inland, a place where ships could land, cargo could move, and people could step off the water and into the interior. Before highways, before railroads reached everywhere, a town like this was not just a town, it was a doorway. The settlement first grew near the water under earlier names, including Indian Point. In 1849, the town took the name Indianola, and people kept coming. European immigrants, many of them German, arrived along this coast, stepped onto muddy docks, loaded their belongings into wagons, and moved inland to build new lives across Texas. For thousands of people, Indianola was not a name in a history book. It was the first Texas ground beneath their feet. Then the port became more than a landing place. Charles Morgan, one of the major steamship operators on the Gulf Coast, chose Indianola as a terminus for his line on Matagorda Bay. That decision helped turn the town into a commercial anchor, linking ships, goods, travelers, and the Texas interior. Warehouses rose near the waterfront. Carts and animals filled the streets. Merchants worked the docks. Families moved west. From 1852, Indianola served as the county seat of Calhoun County. At its height, more than 5,000 people lived here. For a time, Indianola stood as one of the most important ports in Texas. Second, many said, only to Galveston. But every doorway has two sides. Indianola was open to Texas. It was also open to the Gulf. The same water that made the town valuable also made it vulnerable. The town sat low against the bay. On calm days, that was its advantage. When the Gulf changed, it became the danger. In September of 1875, the weather began to turn. At first, it may have looked like another Gulf storm building offshore. People on this coast knew wind. They knew rain. They knew the bay could rise. But this was different. The wind climbed. The water darkened. Low clouds dragged across the sky. Ropes pulled tight against the docks. Warehouse doors slammed. The bay began to move in a way that no longer felt familiar. Then, it came ashore. Water pushed out of Matagorda Bay and into Indianola. The streets that had carried wagons became channels. Barrels and boards drifted where people had walked. Wooden buildings strained under the wind, and the waterfront, the heart of the town's economy, became the place hit first and hardest. This was not just damage, it was a warning. The hurricane of 1875 devastated Indianola and caused great loss of life. Some estimates place the death toll in the hundreds, but the exact number is hard to know with certainty. Buildings were shattered. Families were broken. When the water finally pulled back, only a small number of structures were left standing undamaged. A town that had looked certain suddenly looked fragile. And yet, Indianola did not disappear. That is the turn that matters. After the first storm, people returned to the wreckage. They cleared debris. They looked at what could still be saved. They counted the cost, looked back toward the bay, and made the choice that would shape everything after. They rebuilt. There is courage in rebuilding after disaster. But there is also a harder question beneath it. Why build again in the same place the water had just destroyed? For Indianola, the answer was simple and complicated. The town still had its location, and location was the reason it had mattered. It still had wharves, warehouses, businesses, debts, graves, and people who had poured years of life into that coast. A place that once felt like the future is not easy to abandon after one terrible night. So Indianola came back. But it did not come back the same. The rebuilt town was smaller, quieter. The confidence that had filled its streets was thinner now. The shoreline still looked familiar, but something underneath it had changed. The first storm had not ended Indianola. It had ended the belief that Indianola was safe. For the next several years, life continued. Ships still came. People still worked the docks. Houses still faced the wind. The town had survived the storm, but it had not survived the warning. Out in the Gulf, the danger had not disappeared. It had only waited. 11 years later, in August of 1886, another hurricane rose out of the Gulf of Mexico and turned toward the coast. This time, Indianola did not meet the storm as a rising city. It met it as a wounded one. There were fewer buildings now, less margin, less certainty. The town had already learned what the Gulf could do, and still it stood in the same low place, facing the same open water. Then, the storm struck. Wind tore across the waterfront. Water climbed into the streets again. Dock posts bent under the surge. Warehouse doors broke loose. The rebuilt town faced the same force that had nearly destroyed it before. Only now, there was less left to protect. And then came the part that made the second storm different. After the wind and water, fire broke out in what remained of the town. The destruction that began in 1875 was finished in 1886. After the first storm, the ruins still looked like something that might be repaired. After the second, they looked like a decision: stay and fight the Gulf again, or leave and let the shoreline keep what was left. This time, the question was no longer, can Indianola rebuild? It was, why would anyone try? The first storm destroyed buildings. The second storm destroyed the reason to build them. And this time, the people who remained began to leave. A town rarely disappears in a single moment. First, the people leave. Then the routes change. Ships and trade find safer harbors. Roads that once led to Indianola begin leading somewhere else. Then the businesses do not return. Finally, the name on the map becomes quieter than the names of the places that survived. That is how Indianola ended. Not in one dramatic night, but in a slow withdrawal. By 1887, the county seat had been moved, and the town site was effectively abandoned. The gateway had closed, and something closed with it. Indianola had been a landing point for immigrants, a port for goods, a county seat, and a link between the Gulf and the Texas interior. It had been one of the doors through which thousands of people first entered the state. When it was gone, Texas did not stop. Other ports, railroads, and towns carried the future forward without it. But a version of Texas was lost there all the same. Not just streets of wooden buildings, a future that might have grown around a city that no longer exists. History is not shaped only by people, politics, and money. Sometimes it is shaped by water. Today, Indianola does not announce itself like a famous lost city. There are no crowded docks, no steamships waiting in the bay, no wagons loaded for the road inland. There is only the shoreline, the wind, the water, a historical marker, a small cemetery, and the heavy silence of a place that used to matter. That silence is what makes Indianola different from an ordinary ghost town. It was not simply abandoned because the money ran out. It was not just passed by. It was built on the edge of opportunity and on the edge of danger. The Gulf of Mexico gave Indianola its reason to exist. Then, slowly and twice, the Gulf took that reason back. Texas did not forget Indianola all at once. The water took the buildings, time took the noise, and what remains is a shoreline where a city once tried to become the future of Texas. Twice.